Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight, in our ongoing tribute to our Medal of Honor winners, we're going to honor Sergeant Major Jon Cavaiani, who died recently at the age of 70. Then Staff Sergeant Cavaiani won his Medal of Honor in December of 1974 for his actions in June 1971 at Hickory Hill, Hill 950 in Northwest Quang Tri Province near the demilitarized zone. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani, along with Army Sgt. John Jones, were in charge of a top-secret, highly sophisticated radio relay station that was monitoring North Vietnamese troop movement from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. By this time, the war was winding down. The North Vietnamese had an advantageous position, and American troops were being withdrawn from all over South Vietnam. Hickory Hill was actually the final Allied presence in northwest South Vietnam after the infamous Siege of Khe Sanh in the summer of 1968, and this was its final abandonment 3 years later. Their team was composed primarily of what the newspapers today call indigenous troops. They were in fact the brave Montagnards, who we'll talk about in a second. On June 4, 1971, the base was overrun by invading North Vietnamese troops, and it was through Sergeant Cavaiani's heroism and that of Sergeant Jones, who should not go unmentioned in this story, that many of these Montagnards were saved. Army Sergeant Jones was killed during the battle, but unfortunately his remains were not identified for 41 years until 2012, and he is currently buried in Arlington National Cemetery. I should mention that 40 years after the battle, Sergeant Cavaiani traveled back to Quang Tri Province to help identify the spot where Sergeant Jones fell, and that helped identify his remains. I want to point out a couple of things about Sergeant Cavaiani's heroism. It in no way affected the ultimate outcome of the war. By that point, the South Vietnamese troops were no longer able to stop the inflow of North Vietnamese regulars into South Vietnam. His heroism, that of Sergeant Jones, and that of the Montagnards was not recognized by the American press at the time, and even today, in the major obituaries such as those from the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Montagnards are not even mentioned, other than calling them indigenous people. The Montagnards were the hill people of the central highlands of what was then South Vietnam. They're somewhat analogous to our Native Americans. They were brave, loyal fighters. They were especially loyal to the Special Forces, who had high respect for them. They were treated badly, they were disrespected by successive governments in Vietnam, the Japanese, the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and even the American Army at times. But Special Forces, as I said, had high regard for them, and despite the disrespect, they saved many American lives and many South Vietnamese lives. But on that day in 1971, Staff Sergeant Cavaiani repaid the favor. From the Congressional Medal of Honor website, Staff Sergeant Cavaiani's Medal of Honor award reads as follows. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty in action in the Republic of Vietnam on 4 and 5 June 1971 while serving as a platoon leader to a security platoon providing security for an isolated radio relay site located within enemy-held territory. On the morning of 4 June 1971, the entire camp came under an intense barrage of enemy small arms, automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortar fire from a superior-sized enemy force. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani acted with complete disregard for his personal safety as he repeatedly exposed himself to heavy enemy fire in order to move about the camp's perimeter, directing the platoon's fire and rallying the platoon in a desperate fight for survival. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani also returned heavy suppressive fire upon the assaulting enemy force during this period with a variety of weapons. When the entire platoon was to be evacuated, Staff Sergeant Cavaiani unhesitatingly volunteered to remain on the ground and direct the helicopters into the landing zone. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani was able to direct the first 3 helicopters in evacuating a major portion of the platoon. Due to intense increase in enemy fire, Staff Sergeant Cavaiani was forced to remain at the camp overnight, where he calmly directed the remaining platoon members in strengthening their defenses. On the morning of 5 June, a heavy ground fog restricted visibility. The superior-sized enemy force launched a major ground attack in an attempt to completely annihilate the remaining small force. The enemy force advanced in 2 ranks, first firing a heavy volume of small arms automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenade fire, while the second rank continuously threw a steady barrage of hand grenades at the beleaguered force. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani returned a heavy barrage of small arms and hand grenade fire on the assaulting enemy force, but was unable to slow them down. He ordered the remaining platoon members to attempt to escape, while he provided them with cover fire. With one last courageous exertion, Staff Sergeant Cavaiani recovered a machine gun, stood up, completely exposing himself to the heavy enemy fire directed at him, and began firing the machine gun in a sweeping motion along the two ranks of advancing enemy soldiers. Through Staff Sergeant Cavaiani's valiant efforts with complete disregard for his safety, the majority of the remaining platoon members were able to escape. While inflicting severe losses on the advancing enemy force, Staff Sergeant Cavaiani was wounded numerous times. Staff Sergeant Cavaiani's conspicuous gallantry, extraordinary heroism, and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. Another thing that I want to acknowledge that fails to point out that he was captured by the North Vietnamese and spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner of war, much of that in solitary confinement, some of it at the Hanoi Hilton before he was released in 1973. Here he discusses his story at the YouTube Medal of Honor website.
Jon Cavaiani enlisted in the Army in 1968, although he was initially turned away because of an allergy to bee stings.
I was adopted in 1950 and raised in an Italian family. I joined the service I was 26 years old. I had several siblings over in Vietnam, and I had been 4F. 4F politely put means they would take my mother before they would take me. Kind of had a doctor with a couple of guys he claimed were 4F, and I said, best luck first, I'd like to check them out. And he goes, what do you want, John? I said, Ian. So I got in the service.
The young soldier eventually qualified for the elite special forces and was sent to Vietnam in 1970. Once there, he forged a special bond with the South Vietnamese people.
I had a Vietnamese sergeant major with me. He was shot and mortally wounded on an operation with me, a MedCap operation, and asked if I'd adopt his son. And I was very close with him and his son in their time. So I ended up having to build an orphanage around my son, done in Nong Son. I had 7 months and about 22 kids, and I continued running MedCaps. I went back to Nong Son, and I was going to go down and see my son, getting ready for the holidays. And everybody said, no, you don't want to go down there. Went down there, and my son was dead, and my kids were killed. The monks, 6 of them were killed. I said, tell Buxy John to stay out of the area. So apparently I was fairly successful in winning the hearts and minds, but I lost my son in the orphanage. So it was smarter for me to go to a different unit.
In the summer of 1971, still reeling from the loss of his adopted son, Sergeant Cavaiani took an assignment to lead a mixed platoon of American soldiers and native Montagnard troops whom he affectionately referred to as his little people. Together, the men were deployed to a dangerous radio relay site located deep within enemy-held territory.
So I went up there. Our primary mission was to make sure the communications could be made from Laos, North Vietnam, through our relay site and down into the headquarters. I got up there, and the camp was a disaster area. So I fixed the camp up, reinforced all the wire and all the access, mined it and everything else. We were starting to see more and more activity from the North Vietnamese, and of course I reported down to my unit, and they'd come back and say, our assets don't tell us anything like that. They continued questioning any reports that we were sending in, and we were seeing 1,000 guys a day and rucksacks, and I had helicopters, and they still didn't want to believe it. I decided, well, I know we're going to get hit. And sure as heck, we got surrounded, and I looked out into the perimeter, and there were Chinese claymore mines sitting all the way around the camp. Well, I grabbed a machine gun, and I would flip the weapon over the side of the berm and then shoot them up. Continued going around the camp, doing this all the way around, and destroyed all the mines. Next thing I know is the enemy flips up all their bunkers from the ground, all their Charlie holes, as we call them, and start firing at us. If I'm covering all the guys, I've got a 50 caliber machine gun. And start shooting up the positions, managed to get all my people back into the camp. We ended up quieting all the guns, and then all of a sudden they started rockets. And we're counter-battering them, shooting looking back at them, I realized I'm going to lose the camp. I've got to destroy all the sensitive equipment that we have out there. So I set all my thermites off and burned all the equipment up. And I thought, I'm going to start evacuating guys.
Sergeant Cavaiani directed his remaining troops to a helipad, where he provided covering fire, enabling 3 extraction helicopters to land and evacuate the majority of his endangered platoon. As night began to fall, Cavaiani defied orders to evacuate himself, opting instead to stay behind with the small group of Montagnards who remained on the ground.
I'd already been ordered to get off the hill, take your people, get out of there, leave the Montagnards. So I go, you gotta be friggin' joking with me. I was a reconnaissance team leader before, and the first man on the ground, last man off the ground. I thought, I'm sorry, I'm not obeying that order. And you can pick up all my little people and you'll see me on a helicopter. So I started strengthening up all our defenses. We had at least half of the camp. And then I snuck up with one of my Montagnards and we planted a 106 round, set it up, booby-trapped it. So when they tried to make this one breach in the wall, then whoever was on it didn't kill. That went off and the first attack wave was all killed. I told my yards, pull back. We had the helipad in between the 2 ends of the camp. I set up on one side of it. And then one of my other yards set up one under the other outhouse. And we had the enemy in a crossfire. We just annihilated them. They never knew what hit them. We hadn't had anything happen in about 3/4 of an hour. And I said, they're getting ready to hit us big. So I pulled my Montagnards back. And I told them, we'll move out. About that time, the whole world come running over that end. I grabbed the machine gun, got up on the bunker, and started shooting at anybody trying to come in. My Montagnards were starting to take off down the backside of the hill. All of a sudden, I got a sanity attack, I think, because I said, what the hell are you doing out there? I turned around, bent over to start to get off, and I took a bullet up through the back, and stopped just short of my neck, and threw my butt off the bunker. Well, Mountain High come running over, and they're going to help me get back. I told them, no, get out of here. And I went in, crawled in the bunker. About that time, they overran the whole top of the hill. We were kind of trapped in there, and next thing I know, a grenade comes rolling in. It was one of ours, and I kicked it up against the radio, and it went off. Took out my radio, so that was the last time anybody heard from it. I decided to play dead, and I remember looking out, and my feet sitting out like that, and there's a guy sitting on the cot, feet hanging down. He's got my boot going like this, checking it out. I guess he figured they were too big. He figured I got killed when the round came through. And he got up and walked out. Sobered me up real fast. I did a nice, neat little low crawl to the door and out the side and over the berm and out through and started escaping and evading.
Unarmed, badly wounded, and completely alone, Sergeant Cavaiani traveled through the countryside for 11 days before being captured by North Vietnamese troops and taken to a POW camp where he remained for 23 months. Cavaiani was still considered missing in action when his Medal of Honor was awarded in 1973. He was repatriated later that year and returned to America, where he received the Medal of Honor from President Gerald Ford.
People ask me what I got the Medal of Honor for. I tell them I couldn't outrun them. I had to fight them, and I leave it there. I was just doing my job. I figured you'd put any one of my guys in that position. We all felt the same way about the Montagnards. Many a time I had put my life on the line for my Montagnard. I've had a number of them that died for me. It's reciprocal.
And I don't have to tell you that after South Vietnam fell to the North Vietnamese, many of his Montagnards were slaughtered en masse and enslaved by the Vietnamese communists and the Khmer Rouge. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps, Sergeant Major Cavaiani, and Army Sergeant Jones. Our gratitude is boundless for what you did. We will never be able to repay it in full.